How I Listen In on the World by Radio by Armstrong Perry. Popular Science Monthly, November 1921. Up to the instant when I thrust a wire into the air and pulled down someone's jazz, I thought wireless was something like a fire extinguisher or a lifeboat, an emergency apparatus for a ship to use in case of accident, but of no immediate use to ordinary folks like myself. My great awakening to the romance of radio came when a friend of mine, who had the wireless hobby, urged me to purchase a cheap receiving set at an electric supply store. "What is the simplest wireless outfit that I can hear something with?" I asked. He surprised me with his answer. The simplest receiving set consists of an aerial, a detector, a phone shunted around the detector, and a ground wire. Except for the meaning of the words aerial, detector, and ground wire, I understood him perfectly. Seeing that I was in doubt, he went on to explain that wireless messages come through the air in electrical waves like ripples on a pond. The aerial, he said, was a wire put up in the air. The electrical waves washed against it, and some electricity trickled down to the detector. The detector, according to him, was a valve which let electricity go through in one direction but not in the other. The juice gathered by the aerial from the passing electrical waves was alternating current, called AC for short. It changed its direction of motion more times a second than the needle on a sewing machine. But the detector changed the current so that it went into the telephone in spurts, always moving in the same direction, like steam from an engine exhaust pipe. That was plain enough. Then he went on to add that all I had to do to shunt the phone around the detector was to hitch one of the two loose ends of the phone cord to one binding post of the detector, and the other loose end to the other binding post, and that I was then to hitch one binding post of the detector to any convenient water pipe by the shortest practicable piece of wire. This was my ground wire. The aerial wire was to be hitched to the other binding post, and then I should be all set to receive messages. This made two wires attached to each binding post of the detector of the wireless apparatus. The only adjustment I should have to make was on the detector. In this piece of apparatus, the tip of a small wire rested on the polished surface of a piece of galena, or lead ore. The galena, he said, was more sensitive in some spots than in others, just as a person is more ticklish on the bottoms of his feet than elsewhere. If what I heard was not loud enough, he said I should have to move the wire till I found a tickle spot. Within a few days after this conversation, I took home a complete radio receiver, which had cost me only a few dollars. On my way home, I began to feel ridiculous. Why should I, who knew nothing about such a mysterious and technical thing as wireless, expect that I could pick up messages from the air with a cheap outfit not bigger than a baseball? However, that evening I brightened up the water pipe with a file, wrapped several turns of the ground wire around it, fastened it tight, and dropped on a bit of solder melted from an old tin can. Then I stapled the wire to the mopboard and brought the end up to the table where my detector and phone lay. There I made the connections according to instructions and put the receivers on my head. With one end of the aerial wire attached to the detector, I stepped out onto my sleeping porch with the coil. While figuring out where to anchor the outer end, I put up my hands to take hold of the galvanized iron pipes that supported the canvas roof. When the coil of wire in my hand touched the metal pipe, I nearly jumped out of my shoes, for right at my ears I heard jazz. That radio outfit couldn't wait for me to get the aerial up. It was using the porch frame. In the days that followed, I spent hours listening in. Sometimes I heard it by referring to a copy of the code, which had been given to me when I purchased my outfit. I tried the stunt one night and managed to translate this message. QST, 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 de NAH, NAH, NAH. Amateur broadcast. If you are interested in this broadcast, please advise by mail. United States Navy, Radio Amateur Bureau, New York. At once, I wrote a letter saying that I was very much interested. In reply, I received a request to answer on an enclosed blank certain questions about myself and my station, and a promise that on receipt of the information, the Navy would send me a copy of certain secret codes used in sending out messages for amateurs. Promptly complying with the request, I was given a number as a registered amateur, and I soon began to recognize certain letters so readily that I could write them immediately, without going through the slower process of setting down dots and dashes and translating them later. Secret codes are made by substituting certain letters for others. For instance, where you receive an A, it may mean B, and so on. The key furnished by the Navy enables you to decode messages. One night, to my astonishment, I found my own name at the beginning of a message. Imagine the thrill with which I took out of the air a reply by the Navy Radio Amateur Bureau to a letter I had written them the day before. Let me tell you that it's the thrill of a lifetime when your government first communicates with you direct by wireless, and you get the message out of the air yourself. From then on, the Morse code came easily. Listening in on the standardized form of the weather forecast transmitted from naval stations was excellent practice. I soon found myself able to catch the concentrated digest of the world's news that is transmitted every evening. At first, I would wrestle for an hour, trying to piece together disconnected letters that I had grabbed out of the rapidly running procession. But at last, I came to a point where I could turn to the family during a 3-minute intermission and tell them what was going on in London, Tokyo, and Rio de Janeiro at the moment, and add the day's baseball scores. In the meantime, my station was growing. The first edition was a loose coupler. This is a tuning device. The simple outfit with which I started was as careless as a pup about what it brought in. If there was music, amateur traffic, and government business in the air at the same time, it brought them all to my listening ear, and it sounded like a Morse family quilting bee with everybody talking at once. The loose coupler, by a few simple adjustments, put out everybody except one person and locked the door. If I got tired of listening to that one, a simple twist of the wrist would put him out and bring in another. The practice end of radio was becoming so fascinating to me that I decided to learn something of the theory. I joined the YMCA class, and in less time than most men spend quarterly at the picture show, I had qualified for and received a government license as a radio operator. Then one day, I discovered the vacuum tube detector. It looks like an electric light, but when you hook it up, it yells like the barker outside a sideshow. A storage battery lights the filament just as in the case of an automobile lamp. A dry battery connects with the plate in the vacuum tube just as it would with the automobile's ignition system, although in this case there is no spark, just a noiseless flow of current. The knobs and switches which control the vacuum tube are all plainly marked. Within an hour, I was familiar with the different adjustments. While using my old apparatus, I had always been obliged to shush the family because the sounds which I heard were not loud enough to compete with their voices. But with my vacuum tube detector, the phone sometimes talked so loudly that I could hang it on a hook, lean back in my chair, and still hear everything distinctly. One winter's night, I was amusing myself by seeing how many different stations I could hear. I had purchased from the Superintendent of Documents, Government Printing Office, Washington, D.C., lists of all the amateur, commercial, and government ship and shore locations of the United States. Also, I had purchased from a private concern a list which included foreign ship and shore locations. One station in calling another gives the call letters of the station called, then the French word de, meaning from, and then its own call letters. By looking in the book, I could find out who was calling whom. The vacuum detector and the tuning outfit that went with it not only brought in all the stations I had been able to hear with the less efficient apparatus, but many more. The old apparatus seldom made audible any signals from stations more than 300 miles away, nor from those which sent out electrical waves that were more than 1,500 meters from crest to crest. The new receiver would bring in messages from much greater distances. I began with the lower wavelengths and several amateur stations and numerous ships of various nationalities. A number of these were sending QTE to NAH, the New York Naval Station. Freely translated, this means, "Where am I at?" None of these ships was lost, but their skippers knew that our government's radio compass stations at Fire Island, Sandy Hook, and Mantoloking can determine a ship's position night or day, in sun or storm, more accurately than her own navigator can. Raising my receiving wavelength, I heard successively Key West, Santiago de Cuba, Bermuda, and finally, at the upper limit of my tuning range, I was amazed to hear POZ in Nauen, a suburb of Berlin, talking with the Annapolis Naval Station. The simplicity of the thing was staggering. I was hearing a conversation across 5,000 miles of land and sea as easily as though it were in the next room. Recovering from my amazement, I started down the scale again. I had just reached 600 meters when a faint signal caught my ear. SOS. The skin tightened on my scalp as it did once when I was awakened in dead of night by a crash outside my window. Here was a tragedy of the seas being enacted within my hearing. I wrote down the call letters of the ship in distress and the words, "on fire." At that moment, before I could catch her position, there came an interruption. Traffic from ship to shore often breaks out in bursts. Into the babel came a string of signals stronger than the rest. I tried to tune them out, but from my lowest wavelength to one far above that on which the SOS was coming, they were clear and strong. Pausing a moment to read the signals, I discovered that it was NAH repeating over and over again, "QRT for SOS." Bluntly speaking, it meant, "Shut up until Uncle Sam gets a ship out of trouble." In 5 minutes, the ether was as silent as a deaf-mute asylum. Then, in tones that could be heard anywhere in the Atlantic, NAH tersely told the situation and gave directions. 3 ships nearest the one ablaze were detailed to go to her relief. Then, the broad interfering wave of the Navy station gave permission for the resumption of traffic. And so, every day, no matter when I listen in, my radio receiver brings me some item of thrilling interest from afar. It is not a passive sport, this radio game. With my transmitting apparatus, I can exchange messages with neighbors 5 to 10 miles away. And all the radio adventures that I am having, any man or woman, boy or girl, can duplicate. I began when I was past 40 and with only a few dollars worth of apparatus. With just my old mineral detector and single phone on July the 2nd, I heard a description of the Dempsey-Carpentier prize fight, blow by blow, given by an expert at the ringside. For this experience, I was indebted to the National Amateur Wireless Association, which served an area of 125,000 square miles with its radio phone reports. 1,000 mysteries of the air are open to the man who will buy a cheap radio receiver and begin. All the technical education he will need, he can pick up as he goes along. Even though his increasing interest leads him to purchase better and better apparatus, as I have, his hobby will cost him far less than the tobacco habit, and become not only a fascinating recreation, but a necessity as great as the daily paper.